Welcome. I am Allison Jones-Turner with Source Booksellers here in Detroit, Michigan. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are celebrating the release of this fantastic book, Suspended: Punishment, Violence, and the Failure of School Safety by Dr. Charles Bell. And I'll just start out just with a little introduction. So today we're going to talk about the book. This book was released on Tuesday this week. And so I'd like to call this a hometown launch for the book. And just a little bit about our bookstore. We're a nonfiction niche. And this book is a perfect book for our store, and we will be selling it we're selling it today. I will put the link in the chat after our conversation. But so just so we can begin a little bit, I'm going to introduce Dr. Bell. So Dr. Charles Bell is a Detroit native and an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice Services at Illinois State University. His teaching interests include school safety, racial inequality, and school punishment, as we can see about Suspended, this book. Let's see. Also, along with this book, I think, excuse me, in our conversation, we're going to talk about the Detroit area in particular. So that's why I'm calling this a hometown launch, although he's hailing from Illinois. So let's invite Dr. Bell.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
Oh, thank you so much for coming home to talk about your new book. Now, I want everyone to know that the website is fantastic. drcharlesbell.com. Is it just charlesbell.com?
drcharlesbell.com, yeah.
Oh my goodness. We'll talk about that later. It's fantastic. And we also included a little video in our Eventbrite. It's like the book trailer in our Eventbrite. So you're doing everything fantastic, for the book.
Thank you so much. Just doing my best to really get the story out here and let the students' voices and parents' voices be heard.
Definitely. So we can I just want to first ask you, how did this become a book interest? Like, there's a lot of teaching about different things, but why did you feel this was important to get into the hands of readers?
Great point, and great question. And I think for me, this book began as a sort of self-discovery and analysis of the area that I was in. So of course, I grew up in Detroit. I'm actually from the North End. I can remember riding my bike past your location before you were there, and even as you've grown into this location. So Detroit is always in my heart, and that location is always in my heart as well, right in Cass Avenue. But I grew up in the Detroit area, and as a child, I was growing up in classrooms that were exclusively African-American. And graduating from high school and then going to Wayne State, I started noticing every semester my peers were dwindling. And even the peers that I had in high school dwindling. And at one point, I reached a position where I was the only African-American student in my class. And I just started wondering, how could that be? We're in Detroit. uh, such a high concentration of African Americans. And I just started wondering, what are the sort of barriers that are preventing Black students from enrolling in high school and college and graduating from high school? And I just started doing some reading. And then I stumbled upon this term, the school to prison pipeline, and research that was talking about suspensions and how they impacted Black students, removing Black students from school and just sending them to prison. And I can remember just sitting down and seeing like a light bulb going off in my head, because I could see this process unfold in my community. I could see the suspensions harming students. I could see students in my classrooms who were suspended and just never came back. And that was it. I realized that I had to study this problem and I had to really contribute to it and solve it and play a role in solving this initiative. And then I remember seeing some research nationally, and they were doing research in Los Angeles and Chicago, and they kind of skipped Detroit. And I was really wondering why, because this is such a huge issue here, and we need our children to be in school. Anything that's pushing them out of school really needs to be addressed. So I realized that I had to do this work. This was a calling for me. This is something that was placed in my heart. So I went into the community and I started talking to students and talking to parents and who were frustrated with this system, really putting the dots together. And I realized that I had to talk to them, that the current research on this problem did not include the voices of Black students and parents in Detroit. And I really had to go here and go home and get those voices and talk to people and understand their problems, understand what they were experiencing, and turn this into a book so that no one could ever say the school to prison pipeline does not exist. No one could ever say that Black children are not being pushed out of school, because they are, and that no one could ever say that these school suspension policies are not harming Black students and parents, because they are. And this is exactly what suspended is. It is proof that this is a problem, and hopefully it forces policymakers and educators and school officials and parents to really come together and talk about this. What are we going to do about this problem in our community?
I had to come off mute. I think that you did a perfect job of doing that. And I have to say that right now I'm at a bookstore. I work at a bookstore with my mother, but both of our careers have been in education. And so mine in the classroom, I would always have anxiety about, regardless of the child's behavior, that they just have to stick, like whatever discipline had to happen, it could just happen in the room, like sit in that chair or, do something, but don't go home, because you lose instruction. But by reading your book, that was a small thing that I was worried about, that they wouldn't be able to get the information. There's far worse consequences of the suspension than that. But why is that, like for a teacher like me, why is that such the only thing that I'm sort of thinking about? I'm not thinking about the other issues.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of times from an educator's perspective, it's a very limited scope. You only have certain amount of time with the students. You have 30 or 40 students that you have to divide your attention into. So your job here is to deliver instruction. And I think a lot of times what we have in our society is that we've set up education in a manner that prevents teachers from being able to do their jobs effectively. When you have 40 students in a classroom, you really can't get to know every student and understand their needs and the challenges that they're facing outside of class. It's really difficult to establish a bond and understand how school suspensions harm students and put them in situations that could endanger their lives in some situations. So I think that this book, again, just brings us a wealth of information for educators, letting them know that suspension, when you remove that child from a classroom, you're sending them home at a time where their parent may not be home, where their parent can't be home to supervise them. And the child is there alone, potentially in a really tough environment, in a tough neighborhood. A lot of things can go wrong in that environment.
Can you talk a little bit about Bill 297?
I know, right? I remember reading this sort of this policy and just saying, oh my. I think there's a narrative going around Detroit right now. And unfortunately, this information really exists only among seniors in the community. It's not written anywhere technically so that people could truly see exactly the damage this bill has had on our community. So in 1994, Detroiters got together and they voted on a $1.5 billion bond to improve schools in Detroit. The money was supposed to be invested in buildings and repairing roofs, upgrading technology, and there was an agreement amongst the community members as to how the money would be used. Now, the money was approved. However, there's a contentious element here where the school board was not allowed to spend the money because the Governor Engler at this time, would not allow them to authorize this because he's in charge of the Treasury Department. They're Republicans. Detroit is a Democratic city. And Governor Engler wanted his sort of contractors to come in and do the work in Detroit. Detroiters prefer to have African-American contractors. So there became a political fallout. And as a result, the Governor Engler and Senator Dan DeGros decided they're going to attack the district. So they passed Senate Bill 297. And I think this is where a sort of careful analysis is so important, because this policy called for the governor to be able to fire and replace any board member in a first-class school district that was sort of failing academically or had financial problems. And they defined a first-class school district as a district that had over 100,000 students. Well, Detroit Public Schools was the only district in Michigan that had 100,000 students, and no other district came close. So it's very clear that they passed this legislation to target Detroit Public Schools. Now, even within their own sort of parameters for a state takeover, Detroit Public Schools did not have a financial emergency, and the test scores were actually increasing and better than some of the test scores in these suburban areas and primarily white high schools or school districts. But because they targeted a school district with over 100,000 students, only Detroit Public Schools was under this sort of scope, under this microscope. So they replaced and fired all of the board members. Governor Engler did this and Senator Dan DeGros. And then they hired and appointed their new board members, individuals who had no experience in education. These are all CEOs of other companies and corporations, and they just misspent all of the bond money. They misspent it all. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars building high schools, and Cass Tech is actually one of these schools where they just spent so much money building the school, and then when the school opened, there's climate control issues, the football field is uneven. They just completely misspent the money. And then they invested money in schools, repairing schools, and these are state officials. State officials are investing bond money to repair schools that state officials went on to close. So they made sure that Detroiters would never be able to invest that $1.5 billion bond money into the schools to improve the district. That money was misspent. And in 2005, Detroiters were given the option to vote and take back the school district. And when they got it back, the district was at $100 million deficit, nearly bankrupt, essentially. And the bond money was gone. 3 years later, the debt increased and it spiraled because of poor decisions by the state policymakers at this point. And then the district was taken over again by Jennifer Granholm. So we have a history here of what I call sort of a state violence, where the state has harmed Detroiters by sort of seizing control, stealing control of the district and passing policies that made Detroiters leave overwhelmingly and led to a series of school closures that almost pretty much bankrupt the district intentionally. And I think the intention here was to bankrupt the district, and it seems like they were really successful. And I think the problem here, in addition to the mismanagement of the bond money, is that right now Detroiters are still paying for those schools. They're paying for schools that are not open, that are closed, and they will be paying for those schools until 2051. So you're in a situation right now where Detroiters are paying some of the highest property taxes in the country for schools that no longer exist, and they will continue to be paying for them until 2051. And the district right now needs services. They need a reinvestment so they can repair buildings, and they can't do it because they've tapped out all their resources and the state policymakers stole the money, essentially.
This is so right. And if you're watching and you're not necessarily from Detroit, this is why the school district is now called Detroit Community School District versus DPS, where DPS is like holds the debt or something. It's so crazy, and it's violent. It's really, and the school closures, I have to say. So I went to Martin Luther King Jr. Senior High School. And it wasn't that long ago that 2 schools closed. And this is in my memory, Dr. Bell, because as an alumni, we were sort of called to task because 2 schools closed and then moved into King because they built this building. That's like the construction that you were talking about, moved into King, and one was an absolute rival school. Can you imagine how that was like a bomb just let off? And so there was a lot of students and families that didn't want to be there, and a lot of, just violent responses, which were mostly contained on like the football field previously. Like their neighborhoods weren't necessarily next to each other, so they weren't like living next to each other. And there was a lot of agitation and a lot of issues. It's calmed down to this point, but I couldn't imagine why anyone in charge would allow that. Or I understand that their school closed and we're still on the east side. I understand that, but it's like they didn't think of that. It's like a power keg getting ready to explode.
Exactly. And I think it's one of those things where we have to even raise the question, did those schools need to close? Because if Detroiters had control of the district, they would have never left. And if we were allowed to spend the bond money the way we wanted to spend it, then those schools would have never closed. So I feel like state policymakers, they came and they introduced a sort of political violence. We don't think about violence being political, but policy can be harmful, it can be violent, and policy can, take food off the table. It can destroy schools, as we've seen here in Detroit. And I think that we really need to understand the role of social policy in our society and the harms that it can create. And just like you said, a lot of these schools were rival schools. They were rival sort of gangs, and that you should not close those schools or merge them together. It's inappropriate. You just know this, and they did it anyway because they didn't live in Detroit. The policymakers who were passing these laws, they didn't live in Detroit. They didn't really care, and they introduced a sort of violence that it is impacting our community and harming our community. And I think in addition to that sort of violence, they ended up closing so many schools. Between 1999 and 2016, we lost 160 schools nearly. And it's at one point where do I go to school? Because I can't get there. There's no bus to help me get to school at some point. And I think at some point, we really need to just start talking about this, because how many school closures does one need before it becomes a national disaster, or a local disaster at some point? 160 schools is a lot of schools to lose in such a short period of time.
Do you think suspension as a way to remove the Black students from a population or remove them from a school, do you think, I imagine, this is just my imagination, that this would happen in suburban schools, but I also think it may happen in like charter schools or, any school that wants to control their population. They want it to behave a certain way or look a certain way.
Exactly. And I think you're right. You're exactly right here. And I think that what we have to understand is that education has always been racialized, and it's always been a sort of anti-Black institution, where before 1954, it was illegal for Black children to walk into a school with a white child there. There was policy, government enforced policy that prevented Black children from being able to get education. And even after 1954, a lot of textbooks and a lot of books really missed this. And we celebrate Brown v. Board of Education, and we pretend like Brown v. Board, the Supreme Court decision that desegregated public schools, we pretend like it was actually effective, and it was not in most cases. There's a history in which school districts resisted Brown v. Board of Education. And this history, it affects us here in Detroit, where Pontiac Public Schools notoriously resisted this court order all the way into 1970. And the Honorable Judge Damon Keith had to force Pontiac Public Schools to racially integrate in 1970. And this is where dates are important, because as soon as Black children gain access to public schools around the country, where other judges are forcing schools around 1968, 1970 to accept Black students and to bus them to school if necessary, the first publication that documents school suspensions and their targeting of Black children comes out in 1974.
I think another, and I remember reading in your book about Judge Damon Keith, about that that ruling, the ruling that he made. Why were suburban schools or Metro Detroit, why was that interesting to your research? Because you did interview in both places, right?
I did, yeah. So initially it was not. And this is where the project takes on a life of its own. So my first project, I was interviewing Black students and parents in primarily Black school districts. So I started in Detroit in Southfield. And what I found is that school suspensions were so harmful. They're harming students' grades, parents are losing their jobs, and parents recognized that school suspension was this violent process that was harming their children. So what they did was they were packing up and they were leaving Detroit or Southfield in hope that Warren, Farmington Hills, or the suburban areas, because they had more resources, would be a more comfortable environment for their children. So when I completed my study in Southfield and Detroit, I thought the project was over at that point. I had all my data, but 2 or 3 months later, I'm getting calls from the same parents. Hey, it's worse here than it was in Detroit. It's worse in Farmington Hills than it was in Detroit. You need to come back and continue to start interviewing, because we need to talk. And at that point, I was completely stunned. So I got back into the field. I started interviewing more parents and just really understanding that many of these parents were starting in one setting. They're starting in a Farmington Hills, and then they're moving back to Detroit because they see that their child is in a classroom with all white students and all white administrators, and they're being targeted because of their hair, their style of dress. So they felt that a school in Detroit would be better for their child. And then they are targeted, and then they just want to move again. So it's almost like a musical chairs, where parents are just like, I don't know where I can educate my child and feel comfortable. I don't know where it's safe. because everywhere my child goes, they're being suspended, they're being targeted, they're being racially profiled, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting to the point where I keep taking off work. I'm being late. I'm getting suspended from my job. I'm at work talking about suspensions because my child gave somebody a hug, or because my child has an afro hairstyle, or my child will wear braids this day. And it's harmful, and I don't know what to do. So that's exactly why I was going from Detroit to the suburban areas, and because the parents are just moving around. And I think a lot of times we don't understand the full ramifications and the weight of that decision, to literally pack up everything you have and move to another location, only to find out that the schools are targeting your child even more. Most parents don't have the resources to do that, number one. And those that do can only do it so many times.
I think the author, is it Monique Morris? She wrote a book called Push Out,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about girls in school. I don't think it's definitely about suspension, but I just think it's about violence, seeing little girls as threats and different things like that. I think another kind of aspect of suspensions in schools, we talked about the parents, losing their jobs, time off work, having to pick up the child, taking care of the child while they're supposed to be at school and a parent's supposed to be at work, the loss of instruction. But when you talk to students that didn't seem to care if they were suspended or not, or they didn't have that type, they didn't have the worry of their parent, they didn't have the worry of the teacher, and they also didn't think about how this is going to affect them, the school to prison pipeline, like they're sort of needing to resist it. Was that hard to hear when you were interviewing?
Certainly. And I think it was not only present and as I was interviewing students, but even in my recruitment of students. Some of the students, when I would recruit them, they would ask what the project was about, and I would tell them that I'm interviewing students to understand how suspensions impact their lives. And a lot of the students several of them would respond, why suspensions? Everybody gets suspended. It's normal. And it's not normal. And that was really disturbing to hear, that you are in a school where they're issuing so many suspensions that your version of normal is to be suspended. I was asking students about their friends, how many suspensions did you have? And then I'd ask them, how many suspensions did their friends have? And I found that a lot of these students were establishing friendships based on being suspended. It was a form of trauma. It was a form of bonding for these kids. I'm suspended, you're suspended. We can be friends now because we are sort of bonded in this sort of trauma that the school has inflicted upon us. But the students weren't recognizing it as trauma. It's normal to us. I'm getting suspended so many times and I'm missing so many school that being out of school is kind of the norm for me. That's dangerous. It's dangerous for a child, particularly in our society where we know that our children need to be in school. They need a high school diploma. They need some kind of higher education to be competitive in the job market nowadays. A high school diploma for many people it's not enough for a lot of people. You needed some sort of higher education or a trade. And to be in an environment where I'm getting a 10-day suspension, 20-day suspension, I've talked to a lot of the kids that I've interviewed, they had 15, 20 suspensions before they got to the 9th grade. That's a lot of suspensions, That's a lot of school you've missed. It's a lot of learning you've missed. So you're so far behind, you don't even realize it.
Definitely. Also, they're behind, in their work. But I also think that the the parents in particular, you interviewed students and parents. Did you have any interesting or notable responses from parents? Did they know that this suspension thing was wrong? Like it should not be happening?
Yeah,
Or,
and they were
did
very
they know
vocal
that?
about it. They were very vocal about it, and they were very frustrated about the suspensions. A lot of the suspensions were for very minor and petty reasons, or for a complete misinterpretation of the child's behavior. And I think that was what was frustrating for many parents. I had one parent who was at work. He got a call. The call said, "Your daughter is being suspended. You need to come to the school immediately to get her off school grounds." And he has to take off of work. And he gets to the school, and his daughter was receiving a 5-day suspension because she hugged a boy on school grounds. Really? You made me leave work for hugging a boy after school. That's not what suspensions were for, let alone a 5-day suspension. So you're removing a child from school for 5 days where she can't learn, and she can't get her makeup work. She can't access any instruction because she gave somebody a hug at school. So those are frustrating. I had other parents whose children were diagnosed with behavioral disabilities, and they'd met with school officials, the principal and school social worker, and they created an individualized education plan for the child, got all the resources they needed, and then as soon as the parent left the meeting, the next day, they're issuing more suspensions. They're completely disregarding the IEP and violating all the policies and parameters that were designed to protect students with disabilities from these unnecessary school suspensions. So parents were very frustrated. They recognized that this was problematic, and this is why they were willing to leave. They're willing to uproot their entire household in response to these school suspensions. And I think that once parents got involved and they really understood that it's inescapable. It doesn't matter if I'm in an inner city school district or suburban school district, it's the same thing, because schools have always been a sort of anti-Black institution where they've contested Black involvement, enrollment, and the only reason that Black children are allowed in schools right now is because the federal government forced schools to accept Black children. And there's never really been a conversation nationally about the fact that this was a forced arrangement. It wasn't just like, Black students just walk in one day and they were greeted and everything was great and there were happy days. No, in Black children, there were rocks thrown at them, bricks thrown at kids who were contesting this sort of racial integration in the public schools. And we've never had a conversation. And at this point, we need to, because Black children are being harmed, they're missing school, parents are losing their jobs. A lot of these suspensions are illegal, and we need to know why. We need to know, why is Blackness being criminalized in our society? Why is Afro hairstyles, why are braids being criminalized, hairstyles being criminalized? If you're not going to accept Black children for who they are, then maybe we need to rethink this arrangement.
Definitely. Can you tell me what you mean by educator-targeted violence?
Yes. So again, just following the data here, I had a lot of children who felt that they were unsafe in school. And because they were unsafe, and because they were in schools with metal detectors, guards, and law enforcement officers, and none of them protected them, they felt they had to protect themselves. So I started interviewing students, and they told me that I'm protecting myself by earning suspensions. And fighting and earning suspensions provided some sort of toughness and popularity and respect that protected me in the absence of reliable safety measures. I get into a fight, I win that fight, nobody's gonna mess with me because I just got a suspension. I'm a tough guy now. So a lot of these kids were earning so many suspensions because they were in so many fights, because they felt they had to continuously protect themselves and earn their respect. And it just transformed entire schools. And I started understanding this, and I wondered, how are you earning the highest level of respect and toughness? Because it just seemed like you get into a fight, you earn the toughness and respect, but after a week, nobody remembers. So now you got to earn and prove yourself again, or you'll be targeted and beat up. So a few students actually told me that I earned the toughest, or I earned the highest level of respect and toughest reputation that offers the maximum sort of protection by lashing out and attacking teachers. And for me, that was a step back, like, whoa, that's something that I never even thought about. So I started interviewing teachers at this point to see if they were aware of this problem, the fact that students felt that they were unprotected and unsafe. And that's what led them to use fighting as a strategy to protect themselves, which led them to attack teachers. And then I learned that there were other pathways to teacher victimization or educator targeted violence as well. A lot of these students, they came to school, and some of them were just like me. I left home at 17, and it was tough. Some days I didn't know where my next meal was going to come from. And a lot of these kids were just doing the best that they could. They came to school, some of their clothes were dirty. And the educator may have made a joke about the student's clothes. Haha, your clothes are dirty today. And that just completely set the student off. You disrespected me. And if I don't do something to the educator to demand respect or affirm my toughness, then I'm going to get attacked by my peers because they're going to think I'm weak because I didn't do anything when this educator made fun of me. So that's one sort of dynamic that led to educator targeted violence. Other students expressed frustration about their schoolwork. I'm in a math class, it's too hard, I don't get this, now I'm going after the teacher. So that was another pathway to educator targeted violence. And other students were in classrooms, and these were high learners. These are students who recognize that there's lots of violence in my neighborhood. I need to be successful, get a high school diploma. I need to get a college education. And I'm in a school that doesn't have books, doesn't have resources. There's no chemistry equipment. There's no resources in my school. And I'm blaming the first sort of representative of the education system, which is my teacher. I'm taking all my frustration out on my teacher at that point. And because students may have had one bad experience with a teacher, and that just led them to have a sort of all-encompassing distrust of all educators. In some instances, the teacher may have done nothing wrong. The student may have had a bad experience with a math teacher who teased them because their shirt was dirty, and now they just don't like any teacher. I don't trust teachers anymore. So I get to science class, and the science teacher says something to me, and I'm just attacking the science teacher, sort of removing the aggression from the target and displacing it to another source. Triggered displaced aggression is what we call it. So there's just multiple pathways to why students attack teachers. And I think that this was such an important and understudied social problem where we've had teachers sort of suffering in silence here. Because when I put the flyer out, teachers were calling me left and right. Finally, somebody is researching this. Finally, somebody is asking me what it's like to be in a classroom. And I was stunned. I couldn't believe that this kind of stuff was happening, but I felt that we had to look at the problem from both sides, both the teacher's perspective and their suffering, but also the students who are in a situation where they're unprotected, they're vulnerable. And if they were protected and not vulnerable, this sort of problem, teacher educated targeted violence, would never happen.
This is true. And as you know, there's a teacher shortage. I don't know about Illinois, but in Michigan. And it is very hard to keep even new teachers, in the system, in the profession, I should say.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why. Who will take that job? And again, this is sort of the political violence that has been set up on teachers. You're in an occupation where you're underpaid, and a lot of teachers are forced to use their resources to buy school supplies for students. And then you're dealing with the fact that school safety measures are not protecting the students or teachers from these attacks. So it's become a profession where we've expected far too much from teachers. We've expected teachers to be social workers, therapists, psychologists, And then we're expecting them to understand childhood trauma. We're expecting them to be security guards in some cases. And then we're expecting them, there's policies or bills around the nation that have really talked about carrying guns. Should teachers carry guns? And I think that it's just unbelievable. We've expected far too much from teachers. And in this country, we really have to have a conversation about our priorities. Why is education the first thing we cut when we need to solve a budget crisis? Shouldn't that be the first thing we invest in?
I agree. That's the first thing that we should invest in and not just cut. So right now, I did put in the chat, I put your website in the chat. I love it so much. And I mentioned that there's more information on the book and the School to Prison Pipeline and a reader's guide. So while you're reading Suspended, you can have a reader's guide on this website. Fantastic. And did you think about making that resource available? Because it's fantastic.
Yes. So the book press is actually sending it out, and I'm sending it out as well, because I would like other faculty members and other sort of reading groups and even advocacy groups to really get together and talk about these issues. I don't think it's enough just to read the book and let it wash over you. I want you to be really critical. Why are we doing these kinds of things to our children, and how does this help us compete nationally or internationally with other countries when we are specifically holding a select group of children behind? Yeah. We are self-sabotaging in some cases. And this has to be a national priority, because there are some of these children are brilliant. Yeah. All of these children have potential. All of them have potential. And we are holding them back with suspensions. And some of these suspensions are just unbelievable and inappropriate and harmful.
And I want everyone to just think about different school districts that may not be Black, and that in their schools, they have the same behavior. Like they have the same kind of behavior, but they don't have the same type of punishment. The students don't receive the same type of suspensions. They may have to sit in an office all day, like in the school office all day. They may be removed from the classroom, but oftentimes they're not removed from the school. And I just want everyone to think of this being a very, very important visualization when you're thinking of our kids, Black children versus the other children who don't necessarily have a different school experience of and being antagonistic or breaking rules at school or anything like that. That happens in all of those schools.
Exactly. And then students are just treated completely different. And there's research on this as well. Black students are punished more severely for the same infractions that white students do as well. And Black students are just denied a proper childhood. This is exactly what it boils down to. When you continuously criminalize the behaviors of Black children, you're denying them a proper childhood, and you're forcing them to grow up in this very violent world, political violence, structural violence, and you're stealing their futures away from them at this point. And I just want my readers to understand that this is not a problem that's Detroit specific. This is not a problem that's just Michigan specific. What's happening here is a representation of what's happening nationally, because I've interviewed students here in Illinois and it's the same problem. I've interviewed students all over the Midwest area, and it's the same thing. And at some point, we have to put all the dots together. As you said at the very beginning of this talk, we connect the dots. What's happening here in Detroit, Chicago, Benton Harbor, Flint, why? It's sort of targeting every major Black city, and we need to really start raising awareness of this.
So we are getting close. So if anyone in the audience has a question for Dr. Bell, I did mention you can put it in the Q&A, or I'll catch it in the chat. So there's no worries for that. I see there is a hand up. Would you like to speak? Let's see. Your hand is up.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hey, how's everybody doing this evening?
We're doing
Good.
great.
Thank you for being with us.
Good. My question is now I understand that, you know, Black children are targeted, and more so Black children who are quote unquote special needs, they're targeted even more. My question to either you, Dr. Bell, or you, Allison, would be now, when teachers were interviewed, did they say that the strength of an administrator, would that fall into play? Whether it falls in line when it comes to suspensions, because there's some schools that don't have real strong administrators, and they just suspend kids all day long. And there's other administrators that are stronger. Stronger in the sense that there's more of a consistency.
That's a great question. So two things here. So in terms of administrators, I have found that to some degree, a very sort of small degree, an administrator makes a difference because administrators can push back on some of these things. But the problem here is that we've been suspending students for so long. You know, this zero tolerance policies and these school suspensions, this was indoctrinated into public schools in 1994, and it's been expanding ever since. So we're talking about a culture of punishment where we've just suspended, and that's just how we've dealt with these kind of problems for decades. So you're in a school, even if you are an administrator who doesn't favor suspension, you're in a building where that's all they've been doing for 20, 30 years. So they don't know anything different. Now, the second point of this is a lot of this is what I call political violence, because when we talk about classrooms, research tells us that there should not be more than 20 students in a classroom. And that is what allows a teacher to be able to give the students that individual attention and call them out when something is happening at home and give them the proper attention when they are acting out and things like that, and avoid the suspensions. But when policymakers take money away from education and then they create an environment where there's 40 students in a classroom, a teacher can't do their job in that environment. You've handicapped teachers and you've placed them in a position where when we tell teachers, you should be pulling a student out, you should be giving them individualized attention, the teacher's response is, I can't. There's 40 students in the classroom. If I'm giving, one student individualized attention, there's 39 other students over here who I'm ignoring. And I have no help, I have no support, I have no resources. And then we really just have to question, why is this always a problem in our Black cities? Because our politicians just keep removing the resources from us. They keep taking the books, they keep taking all the funding. When we think about the things that are being cut, social workers, psychologists, teaching assistants, why? That doesn't help. So politicians have created this problem. It's not a teacher problem. And I think that's one of the points that I make in the book, is that up to date, we've blamed teachers for the school to prison pipeline. And to some degree, teachers have to learn, because we have to remember that 80% of our teaching force is white. And there are some cultural issues that are important here. However, any teacher who's in an environment where there's 40 kids in the classroom, their hands are tied. And I understand that. And I think that we have to understand that. And at some point, we have to start pointing the finger at violent policy.
thank you. I don't see any more questions. So I have a question. We'll wait and see if there's something else that comes up. What to do now? I mean, this is like, we have this, would an answer be community schools? Or, I mean, like you said, this has been happening for years and years and years. And so do we just need to reconstruct school?
It's a great question. And I think that at a time where we are reimagining law enforcement and policing, I think we should also reimagining public schools and how we discipline students, how we keep students safe. None of it's working. Law enforcement isn't working to our needs. Schools are not working to our needs. So I would like to see those sort of conversations merge and just reimagine our society. We made it this way, we can unmake it. And we have to have a conversation. So suspended is a conversation starter. It's evidence that what we've done for the last 30, 40 years, 50 years in some cases, has not worked. It has not been successful. It has failed on all levels. We've harmed students, we've harmed communities irreparably, and we cannot continue down this road. So what I would like to see is a national sort of decree on how do we keep our students safe and how do we discipline students and how do we reimagine public education. Nationally, we need some sort of conversation, and then that conversation needs to be facilitated locally. We need parents, researchers, policymakers, students, everybody in a room, in a gym, talking about schools. Because at this point, what we've done is we've kicked parents out of the room. We were making policy on school suspensions and school safety. Do we have metal detectors? Do we have armed guards? We kick parents out of that room. Parents don't know about the policies until it's done. We have kicked students out of the room. We've never given students a voice. We've treated children, we've treated students like they're children when it's time to make policy, and then we've treated them like adults when it's time to punish. That's inappropriate. Either they're children or they're not. And the fact of the matter is that they are children. We need to treat them as such, but we cannot deny them a voice. Children know schools. They're experts at it because they are doing this their entire lives. They have a voice and we have to listen to their voices. So I'm not ready to give up on the idea of public schools, but we need to do something drastic. We need districts across the country talking about school suspensions, talking about childhood trauma, talking about the obstacles that children face outside of school. There needs to be a space where students can come into a school and say, this is what I'm dealing with, and I'm not a bad kid. I'm dealing with trauma. I'm dealing with something at home. I'm dealing with something in the community. And teachers should understand that. Social workers should be there to address that. And when we've taken out all of the resources, we've created an environment that really doesn't look much like a public school at all. We're starting to have public schools that look like prisons. And that is a national problem.
That is a national problem. And I want to thank you so much. I hope that that we'll get more time to discuss. You know, this book just came out. So we need to read it and talk to you some more about this. Let's see. We have, yes?
It's me again.
Okay.
Dr. Bell, I want to talk to you, further offline
Certainly.
about your book, because I know time is limited here right now. So I would
Sure.
love to talk. I have some more questions to ask you offline.
Sure. Please send them, and I would love to speak more with you about this.
Wonderful.
Okay,
Did you get the website?
Yeah, I got the book actually.
Awesome. Because I know the contact information is on the website, is it?
Yeah, I saw it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So Just speaking back about the book, it is available at sourcebooksellers.online.com and in store at Source Booksellers. And I don't know if you are going to have time soon, but to maybe do a Detroit podcast with
Definitely.
us, so we could talk more about the book, and the community can get to hear from you just a little bit more.
Yeah, I would
So
love to.
thank you for writing a book that's so close to home, and thank you for coming home virtually for this book talk. And I hope that you have a wonderful experience there at Illinois State University.
Yes.
And that this information, like you said, it's not just here, it's all over. So it should touch like every reader and every student that encounters it.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm just happy to be home virtually. Thank you.
Yay! Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you.